Hey YouTube, Joeboy here. So, let's talk about the very end of chapter 906 of One Piece. If you have not read that chapter, do not listen to what I'm saying, just read it, alright? Stay unspoiled. Do yourself the favor of being completely shocked, confused, distraught, at a loss for words. Because that was my feeling. We're going to do it a bit differently this week. We're going to talk about the very end, what was revealed at the very end, and then later I'm going to post a separate video doing my first reaction to the rest of the chapter. But anyway guys, at this point I'm assuming that everybody who wanted to click off this video has already clicked off, so let's talk about what the National Treasure of MavisHdz is, discussion about it in general, and maybe make a few theories. I want to break down my thoughts and my process. And I'm guessing that no matter what I say, it will sound crazy because the reality is crazy. The National Treasure of MavisHdz, as implied in the last chapter, kept within some sort of chamber, a frozen chamber, a cryogenic chamber, I assume underneath MavisHdz in some way or in some other location, is a giant straw hat. And so guys, the first thing that I want to say is that I'm almost certain, I feel confident at the very least, as crazy as this sounds, that this giant straw hat has some kind of actual power. It is in some way magical. And I believe that we know this because of everything that Doflamingo has told us about the National Treasure of MavisHdz. I could be very wrong. In fact, this entire video could be pointless if Oda is in some way misleading us or trolling us, and this isn't the National Treasure of MavisHdz, but it is clearly implied that it is. So we're going based on that assumption. And given that assumption, this hat has power. And so we'll start off with what Doflamingo told us at the very end of chapter 906. In order to prevent me from telling anyone about the secret treasure hidden within MavisHdz, isn't it fine to reveal what it is already? Power degrades quickly. Anyway, it rots away in no time at all. Doflamingo is clearly implying that the National Treasure of MavisHdz has some kind of power, even if that power can degrade over time, and if it isn't necessarily a big deal to reveal it at this point in time, because it may not be as powerful as it once was. And so next, let's move along to what Doflamingo told us about the National Treasure of MavisHdz in chapter 761. He told Law, "I am part of the inner circles of the Holy Land MavisHdz, for I know of an important national treasure of theirs, whose existence alone, if made known to the world, would shake it to its very core." And so if you take a moment to think about this, if the world knew that the National Treasure of MavisHdz was a straw hat, right, a giant straw hat, then I don't think that it would be a big deal. The straw hat by itself is not imposing or in any way particularly mysterious, without the connotation that it has some kind of power. So what Doflamingo is probably saying here is that once the people became aware of the National Treasure of MavisHdz, straw hat, giant straw hat or not, once they became aware of specifically what it did, it would shake the world to its very core. And as we learned in this last chapter, and also back in chapter 761, Doflamingo implies that the Celestial Dragons would like to kill Doflamingo for merely knowing about it. Doflamingo then goes on to say this, "What's more, if I had had the power of your Opi Opi no Mi that day, I'd have been able to use the National Treasure of MavisHdz and hold the reins of the entire world." Doflamingo, at least in some part, connects the powers of the Opi Opi no Mi with the National Treasure of MavisHdz, and there are two ways in which this could have some kind of relevance. And honestly, if you want to believe anything, you have to pick a side. On one hand, Doflamingo could be implying that this giant straw hat, the National Treasure of MavisHdz, cannot be used without the abilities of the Opi Opi no Mi. Like, you have to have the Opi Opi no Mi, or you have to have the powers of the Opi Opi no Mi used on you in some way, whether revealed in the story yet or not, whether it be immortality or personality transplant, whatever it is, you need that first in order to have access to the hat's power. The way that this makes the most sense to me is that in order to use the hat, you must first be immortal. But there are many possibilities. But I said that you have to pick a side. The other way that you can interpret what Doflamingo said is that he does not need the Opi no Mi necessarily to use the giant straw hat, but rather to steal the giant straw hat. It's essentially impossible to steal without the Opi no Mi. Because after this, Doflamingo goes on to tell Law about how special the Opi no Mi is, specifically the ability to transplant personalities. So the way that this works in my head is that there are certain guardians or celestial dragons, whatever they might be. There's only a few people that have access to the National Treasure of MavisHdz. We got to see one of them in this last chapter. And so basically, in order to be able to steal it in the first place, Doflamingo has to have the ability to transplant his personality or transplant the personalities of his subordinates into one of these people, because they are the only ones that can possibly make it inside of this place. Or from another perspective, MavisHdz is just so heavily guarded that Doflamingo cannot expect to go there and escape alive. So the only reasonable tactic is to bring a gigantic army capable of taking on the entire world government, or slowly transplanting personalities of his subordinates into higher ups within the world government and celestial dragons, such that he can make it inside of this room without drawing attention to himself. As I said, you have to pick a side. Do you need the Opi no Mi to use the National Treasure or not? And I personally, I think, would lean towards you need the Opi no Mi to use this giant hat. And the reason why I'm inclined to speculate this, despite it being very difficult, is that the hat is giant. And I wonder if you need to be able to wear the hat in order to use it. You can't just have it on your person. You just can't just carry it around. You actually have to wear it. Why this would be the case, I'm not entirely sure. But if Doflamingo intended on wearing this hat, it would be impossible in his current body. He would need to become bigger. And one way in which Doflamingo could become bigger is if his personality was swapped into somebody who has a larger body. This could also tie into the world government's interest into experiments in giantification. This adds a whole nother layer to that entire conversation. Maybe the Celestial Dragons want the technology to be able to come bigger in order to use this treasure. But at this point in time, we are led to believe that that is not possible. Believing that it is not possible, the other alternative is the Opi no Mi. But now let's connect this to Luffy's own straw hat. I think it was really interesting what Doflamingo said about the National Treasure of MavisHdz having power that may degrade over time. It rots away. I think that this combines really strongly with this hat being kept in what is essentially a cryogenic chamber. It's extremely cold and frozen, I believe, to preserve the hat and its powers. And so let's make an assumption, guys. Let's assume that Luffy's straw hat, which has been passed down clearly through many generations, at least all the way up to Roger, and maybe even further than that. Let's assume that it originally possessed the same power or a similar power to the National Treasure of MavisHdz. I do think that it is incredibly interesting that Oda foreshadowed all the way back near the very beginning of One Piece that Luffy's straw hat is his treasure. The very same kind of treasure, perhaps, as the National Treasure of MavisHdz. I also think that it is incredibly interesting that Roger decided to give the hat to Shanks, and then Shanks later decided to give the hat to Luffy, as if perhaps trying to aid them in their journeys. If we assume that the straw hat once had or still has some kind of innate power of some kind, this process of handing it down to those who would clearly need its power makes a ton of sense. And so am I sitting here speculating or saying to you guys that Luffy's straw hat also has a power similar to the National Treasure of MavisHdz? And my answer is maybe. But I really do feel confident that at one point in time, it probably did. It really depends on whether the hat itself is symbolic and how long it's been passed down. Remember, Doflamingo says that the power degrades over time and rots away. If we're assuming that the National Treasure of MavisHdz is being protected, then I think you could also say that Luffy's straw hat is not being kept in the same conditions. Now there's a couple bits of clarification that need to be made. If Doflamingo says that the power degrades over time, it really matters how that power degrades. For instance, if the straw hat is damaged in some way and that reduces its power, that's important. The national treasure of MavisHdz does not seem to be damaged in any way, while Luffy's hat has suffered multiple times during the course of this story, and however many other countless times for all the other adventures it has been on. If the power sort of just leaks out over time, that's also important. This could add a lot of significance for the national treasure being within what is essentially a cryogenic chamber. There's such a phrase as being frozen in time. But Luffy's hat has clearly been around for however long. Or perhaps using the power of the hat depletes its resources per se. In this case, the national treasure of MavisHdz clearly has not been used for some amount of time, we're assuming a long while. Whereas Luffy's hat, whatever power it possesses, could have been used by Luffy, could have been used by Shanks, could have been used by Gold Roger, and anybody who came before them who might or might not have had the hat. So at this point, based on everything that I said, you have to come to some sort of conclusion if you want to believe anything. And so my personal belief, guys, is that Luffy's straw hat is ancient and dates all the way back to the Void Century. It was once incredibly powerful, but at this time, it has some power, but not very much. And I personally believe that it has lost power through all three ways that I've mentioned, both by being damaged over time, and as well being used. The reason that the national treasure of MavisHdz has not been used is because it is too big to fit anyone, because you actually have to wear the hat. Which is why the world government and the celestial dragons have an interest in giants, giantification, and the Opi no Mi. But if I'm making this assumption, then I am assuming that there are multiple straw hats of incredible power. So now let's talk about the power of the hat itself. Straw hats do not inherently have any power whatsoever. You take straw, you weave it into a hat, nothing happens. It's not magical in any way. Which means in order for these straw hats to have any sort of power, they would have had to been given it by some other force. In a well-constructed fantasy universe, usually you have various sources of powers and you operate based on the rules that you gave the world. So in this case, the sources of magical powers within the One Piece universe, typically speaking outside of very odd cases which are questionable, are Haki as well as Devil Fruits. So at this point in time, I am assuming that there is some facet of Haki potentially which can be used in order to give some kind of power that has not been explained in any way in the story, or there is a Devil Fruit which is able to give inanimate objects some amount of lasting power. Whatever this source may or may not be, this original source of power used its abilities on this giant straw hat as well as Luffy's straw hat. But given this idea, it is not limited to if it's just giving it, like, there's nothing that should state that it can only give it to a straw hat, right? So this power could also be given to other inanimate objects. It isn't necessarily limited to straw hats, even if it was only used on the straw hats. But the real question is what exactly is this power? And so if we are pre-assuming that Luffy's straw hat was originally an equal force, and although that power has degraded over time, it still possesses some of its original capabilities. Perhaps you could look at the characters who have worn the straw hat that Luffy currently has and find potentially examples of things weird happening that is potentially caused by wearing the straw hat. That's really the only guess that we have. And so guys, you probably just want me to spit it out. What is your theory, Joey Boy? I think that there is some Devil Fruit or some other power which has the ability to weave fate. I think that by using this power on an inanimate object, you can grant it and whoever wears it positive fate. And it's perfect symbolism to use the straw hat as the inheritor of this power of some kind, because a straw hat is woven. And there is such a phrase as weaving fate. In fact, within many mythologies, there exists a group called the Fates. They were often depicted as weavers, and the things that they wove dictated the destinies of men. And so we'll get to the point here. There's a really interesting story about Gold Roger, how he was facing off against Shiki during Ed War, and it seemed as though there was zero possibility for Roger to win. That is what the story tells us. But it just so happens that at the perfect time, a storm arrives, disrupting Shiki's fleet and allowing the Roger pirates to succeed. At this point in time, I am seriously wondering whether or not that this storm would have arrived and saved them had Roger or Shanks not at that time been wearing the Straw Hat. Granting fortune or luck or positive fate, whatever you want to call it, the Straw Hat saved them. In Log Town, when Luffy was about to be executed by Buggy, we noticed that Luffy was actually wearing his straw hat. Did the Straw Hat decide Luffy's destiny and control his fate in that moment, saving him? We know that it takes more than power and skill in order to become the Pirate King. In order to become a Yonko in the first place, it takes a bit of luck. It takes a bit of fortune. Is that how Roger was able to ascend to the top, as well as Shanks and in the future Luffy? By the time that Luffy becomes the Pirate King, will the Straw Hat have exhausted all of its power? There's a common phrase which is heard on several occasions throughout the story of One Piece. The D's bring with them a storm. We hear this from Celestial Dragons and many other people. Is it possible that at this hat's full power, it can do as much as control the heavens? Would that be a common occurrence for a hat wielder to be saved from certain death? This thought is super out there, guys, but it occurred to me. I'm going to share it. Judge me if you like. At this point in time, I am extremely curious whether or not the power which makes the Straw Hats, or whether the Straw Hats themselves are not the ancient weapon Uranus. The ability to control, whether directly or indirectly, the heavens would fit pretty well, honestly. Going back to the connection between the phrase that the D's bring with them, the storm, and the powers of this hat, this would sort of create the impression that the maker of the hats and the hats themselves are connected with the Ancient Kingdom. Obviously, the Ancient Kingdom ended up losing to the world government, so clearly the powers of the hat are at least in some parts limited. They can create miracles, but it's not an auto win. Assuming everything that I've already assumed. One idea is that you could potentially knock the hat off of the wearer. I think it's really interesting that when Ace was killed during Marineford, Luffy was not actually wearing the Straw Hat. That might be significant. But anyway, going back to the Ancient Kingdom, in previous theories we've talked about the Ancient Kingdom's connection with the many various tribes of the One Piece world, including fishmen and giants, as well as Tontada and minks. I've also in previous theories suggested that the Ancient Kingdom might have been a kingdom of pirates, with their king being the Pirate King, and the Pirate King would obviously need a crew. Whether you want to believe this or not is not incredibly important, although I think that it helps substantiate the idea in whatever small way. But I think that my idea is you have two Straw Hats, both potentially having powers. One is normal human size, the other is much larger, potentially giant size. We've connected the Ancient Kingdom with the many various tribes. Luffy is sort of carrying on that inherited will, and eventually within his crew he'll have people of many various kinds of races as well. I'm wondering if the maker of the hat did not create a hat for the members of the Ancient Kingdom, the king of the Ancient Kingdom's crew, or whatever you want to call them, his subordinates. Within each is a woven positive destiny or fate. And the only one that the world government was able to obtain was the Hat of the Giants. I'm really wondering if there are not several other hats, potentially kept safe in Raftel or in some other hidden location. Or maybe over time most of them were destroyed or completely lost their powers. Or potentially their significance was forgotten. Another thing which is incredibly interesting to me is that the minks have a national treasure, and this national treasure was really odd when it was first introduced, but given what we have learned and what we have discussed in this video is just incredibly interesting, which is the national treasure was a dress. Wanda gave that dress to Nami. Was that dress woven? Does it also contain the powers of the Straw Hat? Guys, the name of the series is One Piece, and One Piece has many meanings. But One Piece has a particular meaning when it comes to clothes. Usually clothes are segmented. You have socks, you have pants, you have underwear, you have a shirt. But with a one piece, you sort of combine these clothing together. I'm a lunatic, guys, but I'm going to speculate this regardless of what you guys think of it. I wonder if the One Piece, the actual treasure from within the story, is not the collection of the individual items of clothing that have positively woven fate in them, kept secretly in Raftel. And part of this collection of clothing includes the straw hat which Luffy is wearing. I really have no idea, guys, but I'm just going to throw that idea out there because why the hell not? I don't think that anybody has any really great idea at the moment. But yeah, guys, we started wherever the hell we started, and we ended up somehow here. And we can't take that time back, but those are my thoughts about the strat as for right now. As always, I am curious as to what you guys think about this, whether you agree with anything that I had to say or not. Just let me know. Like the video if you liked the video, dislike the video if you disliked the video. Make sure to subscribe if you want to be notified for my future content. And as always, guys, have a wonderful day.